All right, here we go. Culturally responsive teaching. First off, introduction. That is Lucas on my shoulder. He's my tutor. He helps me usually by biting my fingers and sitting in my lap. All right, first off, for the topic, the teacher must check any opinions he or she has, such as opinions about religious faith, at the door. The teacher has his or her own cultural background and the lens that the teacher views the world through, and it's not the teacher's job to impose that on the student. The Iris Center website from Vanderbilt University stated that we think about culture as something that certain groups of people have, specifically linguistically and ethnically diverse students. We never think that what we do in our classrooms, the practices, the rules, the traditional policies, the routines in schools are embedded in cultural practices. And you, the teacher, need to understand that there are very specific features of classroom instruction that you need to see as a reflection of cultural assumptions and practices. For example, I have very strong personal political opinions, and as a social science teacher, issues I have opinions about will eventually come up in class, but it won't be my job to teach my students to think like me or to share my opinions. It'll be my job to teach them to become critical thinkers. I had a government teacher in high school once who was great at playing devil's advocate. We had no idea how I felt about any particular candidate or party or issue. He just asked us more questions to make us think, and I really admire that now. So it'll be one of my goals to not let my students be able to figure out where I stand on many controversial issues of today. I want them thinking, not trying to spit on answers they believe I might agree with. All right, now on to Winnow. The biggest thing that stands out to me in the description is his involvement in the church. He travels for mission trips, he volunteers, possibly church-related. He spends a lot of his free time socializing with his friends from church, and his family is very devoted to the Seventh-day Adventist faith and is committed to observing the Sabbath, including dietary guidelines of the church. He's more interested in working for the church humanitarian agency after high school than going into the family business. I assume by going to medical school, since both his parents are physicians with a private practice. So that's one culture he's involved in. The other culture, from, quote, data from his family cultural profile assessment, shows that because Winnow was male and firstborn, he's expected to work in the family business in the future. I list them here as two separate cultures because that's where the conflict will be for him, going into the family business versus working for the church humanitarian agency after high school. Now, addressing his disabilities, it states he has a specific learning disability in math, and in addition to Winnow's learning disability, has physical disability that requires assistance with personal care tasks. And he was also recently diagnosed with asthma and has been taking steroids daily to prevent attacks. Let's see, start with a specific learning disability with math. I Googled, do you need to be good at math for medical school? And one of the two first hits I found was, one does not simply get into medical school and be bad at math. You must be good at math and get through general chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, calculus, and statistics. And you must be good and fast at math to get through the MCAT. That's the medical school entrance exam. Another site from Kaplan Test Prep states that some schools will require calculus while others require statistics. And regardless, most schools require at least a semester of math. Now that site didn't sound as bad, but it neglects to mention the math skills he'll need for general chemistry, OChem, a year of physics, plus whatever math he'll need for any classes in medical school. Personally, I'll ensure that in my class, mathematics won't be a barrier to him to being successful. Winnow's clearly a bright student. He's fluent in 2 languages, English and Swahili. He has the intellectual curiosity to want to learn Yupik. So perhaps with continued assistance with math through college and maybe into medical school, that disability won't prevent a Winnow from being successful. I don't believe having asthma prevents one from attending medical school or practicing medicine. And as for the third item, physical disability requires assistance with personal care tasks. I don't know what the tasks are, but if his parents, who are doctors themselves, believe he could attend medical school and become a doctor himself, then it shouldn't be a problem. And as for cultural differences between myself and his parents, his mother is from Oregon, is very religious. I personally encounter and even work with religious people. I don't have any bigotry or bias against any of them. The father immigrated to the United States from Kenya for graduate studies. Rather than having any bias or discrimination, I'd actually like to meet him. He sounds interesting. Since they want their son to do well and go on to college and graduate school, I already respect them for that. I hope others involved with the school, such as IEP meetings, etc., and also outside the school, be respectful. There's a few things that stand out from the Merlin paper. U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights reporting that bigotry, bias, and racism are daily occurrences in public schools in the U.S. I'm not going to tolerate any racism, bigotry, or bias against Owino or any student in my classroom, period. Multicultural education is, quote, not focused on any one group or minority. However, it evolved to address gender, disability, social class, religion, sexual orientation, intersexuality. Okay, so Owino qualifies as being of Native American descent, African descent, being biracial, having a learning disability in mathematics, the health physical disabilities of asthma, and requiring assistance with personal care tasks. As for the 5 dimensions of multicultural education, there's prejudice rejection. Merlin writes that educators can address these potential misconceptions with children early on and challenge them to critically consider the roles of prejudice and justice in the world. That actually sounds like a great topic for a social studies lesson. Not only can I teach all my students not to fall for stereotypes, they can also see for themselves how successful their classmate Owino is and how he doesn't fall into any of the negative stereotypes. The My Life in a Bag, personal product, and family tree activities, also cited by Merlin, all look like good methods to use in the classroom to teach respect for different cultures. Equity pedagogy. Educators modify their teaching in ways that will facilitate the academic achievement of students from diverse groups. It looks like the only modification I'd have to do for Owino in the social science class is to ensure that any mathematics didn't hinder his performance. Now to the Geneva Gay article, culturally responsive teaching. Critical obstacles to culturally responsive teaching are negative teacher attitudes for students of color and confusing disability with diversity. Well, for starters, I like to think that I don't have a negative attitude towards students of color. One of the smartest kids I knew in high school, Paul Johnson, is black, and he went on to MIT. And confusing diversity with disability, mislabeling students from non-mainstream racial, ethnic, and cultural groups as special needs because of misunderstood incongruencies between their home and social cultural standards rather than biological malfunctions or intellectual limitations. Actually, the teacher I observed for this class told me about a student, a middle school age boy. He must have been 11, 12, or 13 years old, who'd been labeled as having a mental disability, but it turned out he'd simply never been in school before. He was brought up from his home somewhere in Central America where he couldn't go to school because he helped his mother every day. He was good at arithmetic because he helped her in counting money as a street vendor, but he'd never been in school until he was brought here to the United States. So rather than having a learning disability, he actually was just grossly behind in everything. Gay cites 4 kinds of instructional reform imperative to bring about positive changes to implement culturally responsive special education. And those are critical cultural consciousness, culturally responsive classroom climates, learning communities, and multicultural curriculum content, and culturally congruent instructional strategies. Critical cultural consciousness is the teacher's awareness of his or her own cultural socialization. As I mentioned at the beginning, the teacher has his own cultural or her own cultural background, the lens that the teacher views the world through. It's not the teacher's job to impose that on the student. The article cites as an example knowing about religious backgrounds of various groups so as not to inadvertently violate their traditions. Owino practices a faith that is committed to observing the Sabbath, So as his teacher, I'd make sure to not assign any homework or other assignments that would need to be completed during those hours. Classroom climate. Gay writes that most students of color perform much better in emotionally warm, caring, and supportive classroom climates. So I'd want to demonstrate, as Gay writes, a personal caring and concern for all my students, including Owino, while simultaneously demanding and facilitating high academic performance. Communities of learners, facilitating students from different cultures, social groups, and backgrounds to learn how to work together. I'd add to that students with special needs, teaching all the students to collaborate and cooperate during the classroom exercises. I'd group together individuals of different culture, social groups, backgrounds, and abilities to promote community. And then there's multicultural and culturally congruent instruction. Students learn better content that is familiar to them familiar to their prior knowledge and ways of knowing. So teaching for ethnically diverse students should include information about the histories, cultures, contributions, and experiences of different ethnic groups in all subjects. Well, of course, that makes sense. That's what makes social science interesting. For Owino, I'd make sure to include materials written by and about other Native Americans and Africans, and if possible, specifically Alaska Natives and Kenyans. And that's it. Y'all have a good day.